Welcome to Thrive with Pride by AgeOptions, an inclusive online space for LGBT+ older adults and those who care for them. This is a recording of a live event held on Zoom, which included a Q&A segment that was not recorded. This month, we welcomed community health workers Caitlin Macias and Melissa Gomez from the HAP Foundation to present on coping with grief and loss. Please see the video description below for a PDF of their slides and other helpful resources.
So I want to welcome our presenters from the HAP Foundation today. We have Melissa Gomez and Caitlin Macias, who are both community health workers and research liaisons at the HAP Foundation. The HAP Foundation is a nonprofit organization that focuses on serious illness support through advocacy, education, research, and workforce development. Melissa and Caitlin cover the West Cook County suburbs, providing education and linking community members to vital resources. Melissa has 8 years of experience in the medical field and 4 years of experience as a community health worker. Melissa has also been a certified interpreter for 7 years. Melissa is a passionate learner who is always seeking to grow and make connections in her community. Caitlin has experience in doing outreach for community resources and working with children. She recently graduated from Dominican University with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Criminology. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you all. Thanks again for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Nina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caitlin Macias, and I am joined by Melissa Gomez, and we are both community health workers with the HAP Foundation. And today we're going to be presenting Coping with Grief and Loss. Next slide, please. So I want to start this presentation off by saying that grief is hard to discuss, that it's not always easy to discuss this topic. So thank you so much for being here today and being willing to listen. If any of this content brings up difficult emotions, always care for yourself and prioritize your well-being. If you find yourself feeling uncomfortable, feel free to step away, turn off your camera, whatever you need to do to get back in your comfortable zone, okay? And this is a safe place to share such feelings if you choose to do so. And it's just important to remember that grief matters. These discussions may be hard, but they're important and they can also help us. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about us. As I mentioned, we're both community health workers, and we both live and work in West Cook County. And a large part of our job is discussing issues and topics related to serious illness and end-of-life topics in our communities. So we've presented on grief many times in our community, and a lot of the time people are a bit hesitant to start talking about these things. But once they realize that this is normal and that we encourage people to talk about these things, they feel that it's safe to do so. So I encourage you guys to put any comments in the chat if you feel like you need to, or any questions. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the HAP Foundation. We are a nonprofit, independent, mission-driven organization. So our work is centered on education, advocacy, workforce development, and research around serious illness, providing guidance, direction, and support for pain management and a better end of life. So our organization is rooted in 4 decades of providing direct patient care. The HAP Foundation now focuses on helping to smooth the path for seriously ill children and adults. We provide guidance to resources in the community. We educate communities and professionals on topics related to serious illness, and we conduct much needed research about the needs in our community, and we advocate for better policies that support families during this difficult time. Next slide, please. So a little bit of our role as community health workers with the HAP Foundation. We build individual and community capacity by increasing health knowledge and self-sufficiency through a range of activities such as outreach, community education, informal counseling, social support, and advocacy. So we inform community members about health services, but we also inform our employers of issues within our community, such as barriers to care or other concerns. As community health workers, we have a unique role to play with those with a serious illness. We aim to be bridge builders, we connect community members and providers. We provide referrals and resources for patients and families to help meet other needs such as food insecurity or rental assistance. And I just want to remind everyone that community health workers are not clinicians or grief counselors, but grief is a human experience. It's not a disorder, it's something that unfortunately everyone will experience at some point in their life. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the objectives. So following the presentation, you will be able to describe some common terms and categories associated with grief. You will understand the myths, the facts, and stigma that surround grief. Identify the ways that you can support yourself or others who are grieving, and learn about grief-informed care, sources of support, and tools for coping. Grief is still stigmatized and it makes many people uncomfortable. So how do we help ourselves and how do we support others? There's tools to help us integrate our grief and cope with stress, including grief-informed care. These are the key terms. So we have grief, which is the reaction to a loss, the aftermath consisting of a wide spectrum of emotions and deep sadness. A loss may be a person, place, thing, relationship, or a situation. Loss can come in many forms. We have mourning is the outward and social expression of loss. It often includes rituals and traditions. And we have bereavement is the deep sorrow experienced at the loss of a loved one. So grief can occur after any type of loss, not just death. Mourning is social and often involves rituals, funerals, wakes, and bereavement is more specific to loss of life. Any loss can cause grief, including some examples of loss are death of a loved one, divorce or a breakup, loss of independence, loss of social interaction, a miscarriage, abortion, or stillbirth, loss of homeland, culture shock, loss of peace, loss of home or community. Grief is normal. This does not mean that we get over losing the person. It means we learn how to adapt to a life without our loved one no longer on earth. And many people who experience grief report longing, crying, dreaming of your loved one, anger, denial, sadness, despair, insomnia, fatigue, guilt, loss of interest, confusion, and disorganization. Also, disbelief, inability to concentrate, worrying with thoughts of your loved one, avoidance, overreacting, numbness, relief, sadness, fear, shame, loneliness and helplessness, hopelessness, emptiness, and loss of appetite. So we're going to go over the types of grief. And keep in mind that although we do categorize different types of grief, just because two people have the same category of grief, they will likely exhibit different manifestations. So some people also feel that categorizing grief is unhelpful. Think of the categories as a way to expand your view of all different ways of grief that can be experienced. Regardless of any category, grief is a heavy burden to bear.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'd like to start off by talking about anticipatory grief. So this is grief before the loss. So often, once you accept and understand that someone you love is going to die, you begin grieving. So this often happens with people who have an advanced or serious illness. As they declined, their loved ones begin to grieve even though they're still alive. So grief that occurs preceding a loss can be confusing, as you may feel conflicted or guilty for experiencing grief reactions about someone who is still here. And you may experience anger, loss of emotional control, and helplessness. And you may also feel grief over the loss of other things other than the individual, such as the loss of hopes and dreams for the future. And this is something that I can relate to. It's something that I've unfortunately experienced because my mother has a serious illness, and seeing her lose like her mobility and some abilities, it's definitely hard, and it's very hard to deal with. And I just wanted to let everyone know that it's normal and that everyone goes through this. Next slide, please. Next is complicated grief. So complicated grief is a clinical label used by bereavement counselors. And while this may be helpful to some clinicians, it may also be harmful because, of course, all grief feels very complicated. And this grief refers to grief reactions and feelings of loss that are debilitating. They're long lasting and they impair your ability to engage in daily activities. So, people with complicated grief often feel that they are unable to resume their lives. And other types of grief could be chronic grief, delayed grief, distorted grief. They all fall under the blanket term of complicated grief. And at times, complicated grief may require help from bereavement professionals, and they may require the help of psychologists or other mental health professionals. Okay, so if you or anyone you know is unfortunately not able to get over or deal with the grief in a healthy way, they may need to reach out to a clinician and see what the next steps are. Next slide, please. Next is disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is when someone's culture, society, or support group makes them feel that their loss is insignificant and invalid. So this type of grief can be extremely isolating. This, this occurs when the death is stigmatized, such as when it involves suicide, overdose, drunk driving, and it can also occur if the relationship is seen as insignificant by others, such as an ex-spouse, a coworker, a miscarriage, or a pet. Or if the relationship is unfortunately stigmatized by society, it could be a same-sex partner, a gang member, a partner from an extramarital affair. So there are a lot of different types of people who might not, who our people might not think that it's a significant loss, but to us, we know that it is. So while grief is an integral part of the human experience, um, oftentimes people are forced to deal with other levels of discrimination and stigmas, and they're struggling for acceptance in their world. And again, this type of grief can be extremely isolating because we feel like we have no one to turn to, we have no one in our support group, and it makes us feel very alone. A lot of the times with these type of relationships and losses, people withhold the support that they would usually offer to any other relationship due to the stigmatized relationship or if their losses seem insignificant by others. So it's a very unfortunate situation to be in. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk about other common categories of grief. First is collective grief. Collective grief is grief felt by a collective group, such as a community, society, village, or a nation, as a result of an event such as a war, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, a death of a public figure, or any other event leading to a mass casualty or a national tragedy. For example, the AIDS epidemic was a collective grief experienced by the LGBTQ community, and it's just an example of how a mass casualty and mass losses affect a group of people, and it causes us to feel grief. Next is traumatic grief. Normal grief responses experienced in combination with traumatic distress, suffered as a result of a loved one dying. They can be dying in a way that is frightening, horrifying, or very unexpected and violent and traumatic. So, for example, if a loved one is killed by gun violence and you unfortunately witness it, you have to deal with your grief and also the trauma connected to the grief. Next is inhibited grief. And this grief occurs when an individual shows no outward signs of grief for an extended period of time. So the individual inhibits their grief, eventually leading to a physical manifestation and somatic complaints. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk about some stages and symptoms of coping with death. The first step is denial. Some people might feel denial. They might not be able to accept the situation and say, this cannot be happening to me. They might not be able to grasp the reality of the situation. Next is anger. Someone who's experiencing loss might feel anger, like, why is this happening to me? Who is there to blame? And it's just a bunch of emotions that you're dealing with after losing someone. Next is bargaining. I know that this is something that I do. It might be something that you do if you have a religious side. I know that I do this when I'm praying sometimes. I bargain. I say, make this not happen. And in return, I will do this or I'll do this. It's something that a lot of people do, and it's very normal. The next symptom is depression, when someone feels that they cannot bear the loss, that they're too sad to do anything else. Lastly is acceptance, when someone's at peace with what happened and they know that they can't change it. It usually takes a while to get to this point, and for everyone, it's very different. Their journey with grief is very, very different, you know? It all depends on the relationship with the person that they lost and their process of dealing with it. In 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced what became known as the 5 stages of grief, and those are the 5 stages that I just went over. Later, she was criticized and she responded by saying that she never intended for these stages to be a rigid framework. Rather, she said there is no typical response to grief because there's no typical loss. So our grieving is as individual as our lives. Everyone will grieve differently. We can't tuck these messy emotions into neat packages. We know that our relationships with people are very unique, so our experience with grief will be very unique. And other theorists have added to this list that common reactions to grief include guilt, such as questioning if you did enough, or if you would have done this instead of this, would there have been a different outcome? And lastly, there's relief, that someone feels that their loved one is no longer suffering and that they are glad that they're no longer suffering. Next slide, please.
So now we're gonna talk about grief is messy. So while understanding stages and symptoms can be helpful, remember that grief does not fit into neat boxes. Grief varies according to the individual and their experiences, and grief is not linear or predictable. And here we have the symptoms of grief. So how does our grief show up? Symptoms of grief can be physical, emotional, and behavioral. So some physical symptoms are sleep disturbances, shortness of breath, tightness in throat, physical distress, and weight change. And then we have the emotional symptoms, sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, loneliness, and behavioral symptoms, forgetfulness, worrying more about others, prolonged withdrawal from normal activity, taking care of yourself. So face your feelings, don't try to ignore them. Honor losses with memorials or other tributes. Express your feelings in a tangible way, journal, scrapbook, or write a letter saying the things you never got to say. Reinvest your emotional energy in outlets and relationships that keep you physically and emotionally healthy. Maybe volunteer at an organization that has meaning to you and your loved one. Plan for grief triggers, anniversaries, holidays, and milestones can reawaken memories and feelings. Give yourself permission to backslide. One example that I have to honor losses, I lost my brother to leukemia when he was 17 years old in 2014. So every year, my family and I, we get together. We have like a dinner for him for his birthday. We buy him a cake. We buy balloons. We write something on the balloons and we let them go. We talk about him. We play music that he used to like. So I feel like that every year. It's really nice. It's a really nice feeling. And then also, I can relate to expressing your feelings in a journal. Sometimes I write things that I never got to say to him in my journal, just to kind of like give me some peace of mind. Supporting grieving people. People will need different types of support based on the loss they suffered and their relationship with the person offering support. So many of us know how hard it is to watch someone we care about struggle with grief. We often feel helpless. So how can we best support people that we love as they grieve? Don't try to take the pain away. Instead, offer your love and support. Don't minimize pain. Instead, honor it and hold space for it. Acknowledge feelings and practice empathy. Validate people's experiences and do not pressure them to grieve in any specific way. Allow them to do what they need at that time with compassion and practice compassion. And words matter. So be intentional and thoughtful with your words. Remember that your view of the loss may differ from the views of the person that you are trying to comfort. Do not tell people that you know what they are going through. You don't. Instead, express empathy. Let them know that you care about them and you recognize that they are hurting. Different relationships require different parameters. Do not overstep boundaries just because you want to help.
Thank you, Melissa. So always remember that grief is hard. It's always okay to ask for help if you need to. Grief is a human experience. It's not a mental illness and it's not a disease. is something that everyone will experience at some point in their life. Grief is a process and it changes over time. And again, grief will look different for everyone, okay? It's important to remember that if we know someone who experienced grief in one way, it might not be the same way that we would experience grief, and that's okay. So we grieve because we've had a loss that has changed our life forever. And grief honors our relationship with that person because we miss that person, we love that person, and grief is a reminder that we love them. Next slide, please. So here are some local resources and support that we gathered for everyone. So there are many support groups available. There are many virtual, in person, and depending on the type of loss or identity specific. Hope Health has virtual LGBTQ grief support groups. Center on Halsted has many resources for LGBTQ seniors. And bereavement or grief counseling is also an option. And you can also search online. You can try the Social Care Network, and the Missing Pieces is part of the HAP Foundation programs, and it offers grief navigators and support resources for people dealing with the loss of a child. And you can email me or Melissa if you need help finding a support group or any other resources. And I know that on Facebook, there are also a lot of grief support groups that people are involved in. They make posts, they meet, and it's a great virtual option. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for joining us today. These are just some other topics that we offer as part of our presentations. We offer different topics including serious illness support, advanced care planning, health disparities and barriers to care, and full community resilience model workshops. So reach out to us if you are interested, and our team presents to communities, other community health workers, and clinicians. So we hope to see you guys again, and thank you so much. Oh, next slide, please. It's just our contact info. We will be sharing that in the chat. And then if, Melissa, next slide, please. And then if you guys can just take a quick moment and fill out this survey, you can scan the QR code, or there's also the link right there. Our positions are funded through a grant, and this feedback provides information that's necessary for us to continue receiving funding. So I'll be putting the link in the chat as well. And then next slide, Melissa.
Thanks again to Caitlin and Melissa from the HAP Foundation for joining us this month. Don't forget to check out the video description below for slides from their presentation, a brief survey, and other helpful resources discussed during Q&A. Sign up for email reminders of future events at www.thrivingwithpride.org. Thanks for watching.